Yeah, you know who it is, and for those of you that don't, I'm Cytonius, the opposite of Euphonius. And I grew up collecting comics in the 90s.
We're talking bass fishing off the station club.
Ultraverse on sale today.
Comic book store. Let's go.
They couldn't be there in 38 for the launch of that Super Guy, or in 62 for the launch of that Spider Guy, but they can be there now for the birth of the Ultraverse.
Climb that way.
Prime Hard Case, first editions in comic shops June 16th. To enter to win one of 200 special edition posters, call this number now.
First, I want to address a couple of things. My hair or my neighborhood didn't look anything like that. And second, were those dudes supposed to be teenagers? Because they look 25. Anyway, the 90s era of comics was defined by exaggerated physiques, edgy and morally gray superheroes, and the speculator boom of comic book collectors. Around this time, comic book sales were at the height of their popularity, with titles like Jim Lee's X-Men #1, Todd McFarlane's Spawn, and The Death of Superman selling millions of copies. But I feel like there's one magazine from this era that doesn't get the shine and recognition it deserves for its impact and contributions to comic book culture. Before comic books and superheroes burst into the mainstream, and YouTube channels like the one you're watching now, it was very difficult to find in-depth articles and content on comics and superheroes. Before WizardMagazine dropped its first issue in July 1991, the only other publications that focused on comic book journalism was the Wisconsin-based Comic Buyer's Guide, the Seattle-based Comics Journal, and the underappreciated Amazing Heroes. Created by GarebShamus and his brother Stephen Shamus, who started the magazine as a weekly newsletter that was sold from their parents' comic shop in New York called The Wizard of Cards and Comics. WizardMagazine changed comic book and geek journalism from niche newsletters and local publications to a mainstream magazine that at one point sold hundreds of thousands of issues a month and was sold in over 70 countries. GarebShamus started WizardMagazine for one reason and one reason only: because he couldn't find a job after college. GarebShamus attended the State University of Albany and majored in art and economics and graduated magna cum laude.
You're a smart motherfucker.
The Shamus brothers, along with Wizard co-founder, the late great Pat McCullum, who also acted as editor-in-chief, created a magazine that not only spoke to comic fans, who, at the time, was a mostly ignored and underappreciated demographic, but they also set the standard for a lot of what's being done with comic book and geek journalism today. In the early 90s, WizardMagazine would be one of the first publications to bring nationwide attention to the burgeoning cosplay culture that would define so much of the current landscape of geek culture. Before YouTube channels like Death Battle would popularize your favorite characters going toe-to-toe, Wizard's Last Man Standing segment would do it first. And while things like superhero fan casting is one of the most popular geek-centric topics of debate and conversation online today, Wizard's Casting Call segment would be ahead of its time as the first major source for superhero fan casting. WizardMagazine would be so ahead of its time with fan casting that they would be the first publication to fan cast people like Patrick Stewart as Professor X in 1995, a full 5 years before he would play the character in the year 2000. Even though Jean-Claude Van Damme's Gambit is either atrocious or amazing. Wizard would also fan cast Alan Cumming as Nightcrawler a couple of years before he would play the role in 2003's X2. Other interesting Wizard fan casts would be Heath Ledger as Captain America, George Clooney as Iron Man, Robert De Niro as Wolverine, Henry Rollins as Deadpool, Brendan Fraser as Kyle Rayner, and even Ben Affleck as Superman.
Why did you say that name?
Other segments in the magazine would be Palmer's Picks, which would shine a spotlight on non-superhero comics and would be written by Tom Palmer Jr., the son of well-respected comic book inker, the late Tom Palmer. Indie comics favorites like Jeff Smith's Bone, Mike Allred's Madman, and James O'Barr's The Crow would be discussed with respect and adoration and presented to Gen X and millennial comic book fans who were looking for more than your typical traditional superheroes from Krypton or Gotham City. For artists looking to improve their skills, the segment Brutes and Babes, which started in Wizard issue 10, would give up-and-coming comics creators a chance to learn the craft of comic book artistry from the underappreciated industry legend, Bart Sears. The segment would later be called Basic Training and would feature a wide variety of comic book artists such as Joe Quesada, the late George Perez, Bruce Timm, and Lionel Francis Yu, giving some of the best advice on how to improve your art skills. And yes, as a former aspiring comic book artist, I studied that segment diligently. Other segments like a monthly top 10 heroes and villains list would show which characters resonated with fans of the era, while Wizard's Mort of the Month would showcase comic book characters who didn't. One of my favorite things about Wizard Magazine was its coverage of comic book movie news and events. The segment Trailer Park will have the latest insights on everything related to comic book mass media related to film, television, and animation. Wizard would debut a full 3 years after Tim Burton's 1989 Batman film would spark a nationwide interest in comic book film and television adaptations. Wizard would be one of the first publications to announce things like the casting of Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man, and Christian Bale as Batman. They would also be one of the main publications to offer behind-the-scenes info and interviews from people who worked on shows like Batman the Animated Series and X-Men. The popularity of Wizard in the 90s is undeniable. The rise of Wizard Magazine coincides with several important events in American geek culture in the 90s. One of which was the rise of the comic book speculator, who, for those that don't know, were people who were only involved in collecting comics based on the idea that specific comics would be worth tens of thousands of dollars years down the line.
I don't have any boys, and I don't know why I'm buying this comic book, but I have a 2-year-old baby, and I figured when she gets grown, this is a college education. And I'll be back here to buy the issue when he comes back, so then she can go to pre-med school also.
The other major event in 90s geek culture would be the indie comics revolution that was spurred on by the creation of Image Comics.
Comic books aren't just for kids anymore. Some people keep on buying them well into their 20s. And at any age, there's nothing a comic book reader likes better than a superhero. But now, comic book giant Marvel is losing 8 of its top creators of superheroes. The reason? Control over their creations.
You need warm bodies, warm creative bodies to create properties to keep your company going.
It'll be nice to write something that you want to write, draw something you want to draw, and it'll go straight through without anyone saying, well, you know, I'd kind of like to change this.
Today, Malibu Graphics claims only about 3.5% of the comic book market. This hardy band of superhero creators is betting that comic book buyers will follow them to a new label the way record buyers might follow a rock star. Greg Lamont, CNN, Los Angeles.
While major comic book companies like Marvel and DC would reluctantly embrace Wizard Magazine early on as a legitimate source for geek journalism, it would be Image Comics that would play a significant role in the rise of Wizard Magazine. Popular Image Comics founders like Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, and Rob Liefeld will have a strong presence in the early years of Wizard Magazine, providing cover art and exclusive interviews for the magazine. But there's one specific thing that played a key role in Wizard being the most popular and widely distributed geek-centric magazine of the 90s and early 2000s. And that would be the direct market. For those not familiar, the direct market was a distribution system that allowed comic books and comic book adjacent paraphernalia to be sold directly to comic book stores and hobby shops. In order to express how important the direct market was in regards to the popularity of Wizard Magazine, I spoke with a really good friend of mine who worked in the comic book distribution and marketing industry and who collected Wizard Magazine in the 90s.
No, I was obsessed with Wizard Magazine in the early 90s. Like, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's something, I guess that's a tough one. from my understanding, and I don't know what other distribution arms Wizard had at the time, but I know that Diamond at least was potentially one of them. The thing that shifted in the late 90s, of course, is that things consolidated and Diamond became the only one. Well, I shouldn't say the only one, but the premier one, like the main one. But like I imagine, like with the circulation of comics at that particular point in time, I think it's less the distribution and just like where comics were available. Comics, you could get them from a convenience store, you could get them from a grocery store at the time, you could get them from a comic shop at the time. There were so many different options that don't exist today because of digital. And also just the collapse of physical media, right? That there aren't many options anymore that would allow for something like Wizard to flourish the way that it did. And so the distribution model has definitely changed, but at the time, it was you could find comics anywhere. I remember picking up books at Highs, you know what I mean? And
Ames,
right, Ames and People's Drugs, and that's right, right. Before there was CVS, that's what it was called, People's Drugs. You were able to just kind of come in contact with them in a way that's not possible anymore, which is unfortunate.
It's safe to say that without the direct market, the comic book industry doesn't survive into the late 20th century, and WizardMagazine doesn't become the most popular geek culture magazine of the era. And we have one man to thank for the creation of the direct market, and that would be the late great Phil Seuling.
My next guest is appropriately a man who devotes much of his time to the study of the comic book. Here is Phil Seuling. Welcome, please. A grown man with a handful of comic books.
I didn't know you were my mother.
How did this start with you? Obviously, as a kid.
I read thousands of them when I was a kid, and the interest never died. It's a love. It's something that you just can't do unless you really love it, unless you're devoted to it. I like these. I've read Faulkner, Steinbeck, Hemingway, and I love these also. This is not instead of. This is in addition to. Right. I think this is part of America's...
What did it do for you as a kid? And tell me why they're so popular. What did it do for you as a kid?
One thing it did was it accelerated my reading speed. I'm a super fast reader without Evelyn Woods, and I owe it to Superman.
Philip Nicholas Seuling would be one of, if not the, most important figure of the Bronze and Modern Age of American comics. He would be the founder of the Comic Art Convention in New York, which would be the precursor to what would come to be known as New York Comic Con. Seuling would create Seagate Distribution, which would be the first direct market distribution company for American comic books. Prior to the 1970s, comic books were mostly sold on newsstands and in local corner stores, but the creation of the direct distribution market would revolutionize the way comic books were bought and sold. Phil Seuling would pass away in 1984, a full 7 years before WizardMagazine would launch. But another person would also be a major figure in the rise of WizardMagazine.
This has been a 20-year trek of mine to have comics become appreciated on the level that I see them as fine art. If it's good enough for Picasso, it's good enough for Mickey.
Welcome to Diamond International Galleries in Baltimore, Maryland. This by-appointment-only comic art gallery houses the impressive personal collection of Steve Geppi. Geppi's is a true rags-to-riches tale. By following his lifelong passion for comics, he went from postal carrier to tycoon comic distributor virtually overnight.
I thought, hey, this is great. I can enjoy my hobby, and I can do it as a business, too. That means I can work full-time at my hobby. What a great country.
If Phil Seuling is the king of the direct market, then Steve Geppi would be the prince. Steve Geppi is a Baltimore-based businessman, philanthropist, former comic book store owner, millionaire, partial owner of the Baltimore Orioles, magazine publisher, goddamn, say something for the rest of us, and owner and creator of Diamond Comics Distributions. Diamond Comics was a comic book distribution company that sold comic books and comic book paraphernalia to retailers like newsstands and comic book stores. While they did file for bankruptcy in January 2025, Diamond Comics distribution was a key factor in the popularity and exposure of comic books during the 80s and the 90s. Through shrewd business practices, they would acquire just about every other comic book distribution company in the 80s and 90s and would become the sole comic book distribution company of the late 20th and 21st century. Diamond Comics would also be the main distributor of WizardMagazine. Because of Diamond Comics' monopoly of the comic book distribution market, WizardMagazine would not only become the most popular geek culture publication of the 90s, its popularity would inspire imitators. Or maybe Wizard was an imitation of things that came before it. WizardMagazine's popularity would allow them to create several spin-off magazines in the 90s. The first would be Inquest Gamer in 1995, which would be devoted to the card collectible gaming culture that will become popular due to Magic the Gathering. Inquest Gamer would be one of the most popular card game magazines of the 90s and ran for 150 issues until it was canceled in 2007. The other spin-off from Wizard Magazine was Anime Insider, which is actually not the first American-produced anime and manga magazine. That honor would go to the 1987 fanzine, Animag. But Anime Insider would be the first truly comprehensive American-produced magazine to focus on anime and manga. Originally titled Anime Invasion when it first launched in 2001, the magazine was the anime equivalent to Wizard and featured news articles and segments devoted to the burgeoning Japanese otaku culture that was emerging in the United States in the early 2000s. The most significant spin-off from Wizard Magazine was Toyfare. Starting with issue 1 in 1997 and ending publication in 2011, the magazine ran for 163 issues, and while other action figure magazines existed before it, Toyfare would be the dominant toy magazine of the late 90s and early 2000s. The American action figure collecting subculture has always been a very niche demographic. Generation X and early stage millennials would be at the forefront of the burgeoning toy collecting culture that would emerge due to things like Reagan-era deregulation, which would create an action figure boom that would cause toys like Transformers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and the X-Men to become some of the most popular and top-selling action figures of all time. This toy collecting boom would be fueled by 80s and 90s nostalgia, and Toyfare would benefit greatly from that nostalgia. The magazine would feature exclusive articles and interviews from people who worked in the toy industry, but the most significant feature from Toyfare would be Twisted Toyfare Theater. Twisted Toyfare Theater, or as it was originally known, Twisted Mego Theater, was a comic strip that was featured in Toyfare and was the creation of several Wizard staff writers and editors, including Pat McCullum, Doug Goldstein, and Tom Root. Twisted Toyfare Theater would use superhero action figures from the 1970s Mego line of DC and Marvel characters in some of the most terrific and tasteless and tacky Photoshop comedy skits of all time. Twisted Toyfare Theater would be so terrific and tacky that it would be the direct inspiration for the award-winning, long-running Cartoon Network television show, Robot Chicken, which would be created by actor Seth Green and Wizard Magazine editor Matthew Senreich.
How'd you guys start with this stuff?
How do we start with this stuff?
Where did it begin?
Tom and I used to work at a magazine called Wizard and Toyfare magazine back in the day.
For those of you that don't know, Wizard was the premier genre media pre the internet, when all you could do was wait for a magazine to be published to give you information about, pop culture and current events.
The precursors to what will become Robot Chicken would be a series of stop-motion animated shorts called Sweet J Presents.
Okay, we gotta come up with another episode in 24 hours.
Who has an idea? Tom? Pat? Dare I ask? Doug?
Matt, I'm glad you asked.
What do you want?
I love you. You love...
This is horrible.
4 minutes of pure hilarity.
These animated shorts would also be conceptualized and produced by Seth Green and several Wizard staff members like Pat McCullum and Doug Goldstein, and would be featured on the now extinct website, Screen Blast, which, if we're being honest, sounds like it has a little bit something to do with something else. Outside of Robot Chicken, WizardMagazine's footprint in 21st century pop culture extends into other places, with people like Wizard executive editor Brian Cunningham going on to be an editor at DC Comics. Former editor-in-chief Joe Yarinello would go on to be an editor-in-chief for the sports news website The Bleacher Report. Staff writer Mike Cotton would go on to be an editor at DC Comics and the indie comic publisher AWA. And Wizard co-founder Pat McCullum would go on to be a major force in mainstream comics, working as an editor-in-chief at DC Comics and spearheading DC's continuity relaunch, Rebirth, in 2016. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of Wizard staff members that would go on to have careers in the comic book and journalism industry after Wizard's demise in 2011. An argument can be made that Wizard Magazine was the most pervasive geek culture publication to have ever existed. But every positive reaction has a negative reaction.
And I've yet to hear a single good word from anybody about this thing that ought to come on a roll. If the paper weren't so damn insufferably slick. For all of that, the publishers kowtow. Even though this tree killer here regularly and continuously cheapens and poisons our field, aesthetically and ethically, they grovel. Even though this monthly vulgarity reinforces all the prejudice people hold about comics, declaring to all the world that we're as cheap and trashy and stupid as they think we are. We sponsor this assault. We sponsor it. We pay for the goddamn privilege. Thank you, sir. I'll have another. But really, when do we finally get around to flushing this thing?
While Wizard Magazine would be considered the definitive geek culture publication of its era, it would also be considered a cancer to the comic book industry. Wizard Magazine would be criticized for its lowbrow, misogynistic sense of humor and its disregard for women in geek culture. It would also be criticized for its disregard of older comics creators, with many of the articles and interviews being heavily focused on late-stage Generation X comic book creators. One of my personal critiques of Wizard was the lack of attention given to black comic book companies and creators in the 90s. While the 90s would see the indie comics revolution, where independent comic book publishers like Image, Valiant, and Dark Horse would break out into the mainstream and be heavily promoted by Wizard Magazine, black comics from companies like Milestone, Ania, and Big City Comics would be under-promoted by the magazine. Like they gave The Pit and Deathblow a Wizard cover, but not Static. Deathblow. Like, y'all motherfuckers really gave Deathblow a Wizard cover. Y'all motherfuckers, man. The 90s would be one of the most divisive eras for comic book culture, with comics like Kingdom Come, Daredevil the Man Without Fear, and Hellboy being considered critically acclaimed classics, while books like Ultra Force, The Clone Saga, and just about any Image comic that came out in 1992 were considered derivative lowbrow cash grabs, and Wizard Magazine would play a major part in the promotion of just about every 90s comic that you forgot ever existed. Wizard Magazine would be at the forefront of the comic book speculator bubble that contributed to the false idea that major event issues and number ones of comic books would be worth money in the future. A major component of the comic book speculator boom would be comic book price guides. Comic book price guides would emerge as an essential component of the comic book collector culture that would gain prominence during the 60s and 70s. back issues or older issues of comic books will become hot commodities due to the rise of a new revolutionary place for comic book collectors. And that will be the comic book store. While it might not seem like it, comic book stores haven't been around forever. In fact, the first comic book store was created in 1961 by a young man named Rod Dyke. He would open Golden Age collectibles in Seattle, Washington. And what would follow would be the rise of the comic book store. Without comic book stores, things like back issues of old comics wouldn't become the foundation of comic book collecting. And things like comic book price guides probably wouldn't exist. In fact, comic book price guides exist because of one man, Robert Overstreet. The Overstreet Price Guide, which was created in 1970, was considered the #1 most credible resource for comic book valuation during the 70s and the 80s. But during the 90s, WizardMagazine would take the concept of the comic book price guide and use it to fuel the flames of the 90s speculator bubble until it burst. While many people have theories and opinions on why WizardMagazine no longer exists, the death of WizardMagazine isn't rooted in an isolated event. Several factors led to the demise of Wizard and its many spin-offs. The end of the comic book speculator started a downward spiral not just for the magazine, but for comic books in general. The end of the speculator bubble would see widespread closures of comic book stores, which was the main access point and means of exposure for WizardMagazine. We would see Marvel file for bankruptcy. We would also see comic book companies like Milestone Media and Kitchen Sink Press go out of business. The late 90s and early 2000s would see a steady decline in sales for the magazine. At the same time, we would see the early signs of the death and decline of print journalism. From 2005 to now, we would see large-scale closures from many American newspaper companies due to the rise of the internet, increases in print production costs, and increases in advertising fees. This would also affect the magazine industry, specifically Wizard. Another major factor in the death of WizardMagazine would be the transition from Generation and X millennial comic book culture to Gen Z. WizardMagazine was created by and for Generation X comic book fans who grew up in the 70s and 80s who were raised on print media, like magazines and comic books. Gen Z would be the first generation to grow up without print media as the dominant source of information and entertainment, which also means they wouldn't grow up with WizardMagazine. While Wizard would be at the forefront of the expansion of the super information highway during the 90s and early 2000s within geek culture, the magazine was unsuccessful in integrating itself into 21st century internet culture. The magazine would have a short-lived online presence. In 2011, WizardMagazine would launch Wizard World Digital, which was an exclusive online version of the magazine, which, as of the recording of this video, doesn't exist and doesn't have much of a digital footprint. In January 2011, WizardMagazine would end publication with issue 235, with a cover that featured Ryan Reynolds as Hal Jordan from the Green Lantern movie of the same year that was both a critical and box office failure. The issue would also feature news of Jon Favreau's departure from the Iron Man film franchise as director after Iron Man 2. And it would also ironically advertise issue 236 of the magazine, which would have featured an article on the cult favorite television series Fringe, and interviews with comic book creators Jim Lee, Bob Harris, and Robert Kirkman. This issue would never see the light of day. While comic books and all of the adjacent hobbies and mediums that intersect into geek culture have always had strong and loyal fan bases, the 2010s would see geek culture shift from being a niche and exclusive subculture to a culturally dominant, mainstream, and ubiquitous societal force of nature that has permeated just about every enclave of contemporary civilization. During the 2000s, the magazine would go through several changes, many of them bad. The direct market orders of the magazine would decrease from 100,000 issues in the 90s to less than 20,000 issues in the mid-2000s. Much of the editorial and writing staff would be laid off, and the magazine would reduce the page count from about 178 during the height of their popularity in the 90s to the final issue only having 78 pages in 2011. Along with creating and dismantling WizardMagazine, GarebShamus would also be at the forefront of revolutionizing American comic book conventions. In the late 90s, the Shamus family through Wizard Press purchased Chicago Comic-Con, which was a more old-school style comic book convention. They would convert it into what's known as Wizard World Comic-Con. The 2000s would see a shift of comic book conventions changing from niche geeky gatherings to mainstream pop culture get-togethers that generate millions of dollars of revenue, and Wizard World Comic-Con would be at the forefront of that shift. Instead of just focusing on the comic book collecting side of convention culture, Wizard World would incorporate things like celebrity meet and greets, video games, movies, and everything in between regarding pop culture. GarebShamus would take Wizard World Chicago Comic-Con and expand it across the United States and Canada, taking over convention territories in places like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Texas. Wizard World would be a major influence on other massive pop culture conventions like New York Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, and Washington, D.C.'s AwesomeCon. The Wizard World conventions would expand to over 25 locations across the United States until GarebShamus was outed as CEO in 2011. After various changes in management during the 2010s, the Wizard World brand would be renamed Wizard Entertainment, and in 2021, the entire Wizard Entertainment media company would be sold to Fan Expo, who would abolish the Wizard name and continue running pop culture conventions across the US. Gareb and Stephen Shamus would move on from Wizard Entertainment and start Ace Universe, which would essentially be Wizard World under a different name. The Ace Universe Comic-Cons would be the latest addition to the ever-expanding world of geek pop culture conventions and continues to thrive until this day. Along with creating what was pretty much the most popular comic book culture magazine of all time and innovating the geek culture convention circuit, GarebShamus would also dip his hand into other business ventures. In 2006, he would be the co-founder of the IFL, or, as it was better known, the International Fight League. The IFL would attempt to compete with the popular UFC brand and act as a more financially beneficial organization for its fighters, offering health benefits and paid training camps for upcoming fights. Unfortunately, the IFL would only last 2 years and go out of business in 2008. In my opinion, GarebShamus is one of the most important and impactful people of Generation X geek culture. As a businessman, he helped to bring niche nerd culture out of comic book stores and integrated it into a wider area of exposure within pop culture. Wizard wasn't just some throwaway magazine about comic books. For a certain generation, it was their access point into the world of comics, animation, and even cosplay. All things that have significant social clout now in 2026, a full 15 years after Wizard ended publication. So, the question arises, do we need Wizard now, in this day and age? Well, I think the world we live in today, where fans obsess and nitpick over the next comic book movie on Twitter and Facebook, or make 30-minute YouTube videos discussing superheroes, kind of eliminated the need for Wizard. I discovered WizardMagazine around 1992, when I was about 11 years old. I had an older cousin who worked at a comic book store in Maryland. She would bring me small boxes of comics because she knew I loved superheroes. In one of those boxes, I would find a random issue of WizardMagazine. I think Silver Surfer was on the cover. When I opened the magazine, it was like I had been teleported to a world where the things I loved the most existed. There were exclusive articles and interviews from comic book creators. The magazine would come with trading cards. There were advertisements for comic book stores and for comic book conventions. In fact, I discovered comic book conventions through WizardMagazine. I would consistently collect Wizard from the time I was 11 up until I was 30 years old. A lot of what I know about comics and comic book history actually comes from Wizard. The end of WizardMagazine was really the end of an era where comic book stores flourished, where people who loved comics could buy comics just about anywhere. And it also represents an era where the world seemed a bit brighter. For me, WizardMagazine represents the pinnacle of my journey of falling in love with comics and superheroes. But it also represents a specific point in my life, and that's the joy and innocence of adolescence. No matter how dark and depressing you might think the world is, or how cynical you become as you get older, I think the most important thing we can do for ourselves is hold on to the feeling of the things that brought us joy as kids.
I love reading comic books because they keep you young, they keep you with a sense of wonder about the world. And nowadays we need that more than ever before.